in. It'll take a couple of minutes for people to come in.
Great.
As you can see, it's populating. Populating. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome. We're going to be starting in a couple of minutes. I'm just populating the session, so it'll be about a couple of minutes before we start, about 2 minutes or so. We've got a large number of people. We're expecting around 40 to 50 people. So bear with me. As you come in, if you don't mind, brothers and sisters, some housekeeping rules. Please keep your phone or your device on mute. It is being recorded. We will be sending a link to the recording as well. We're expecting around 30, 40 people, if not more. We have our guests, distinguished guests, Dr. Abdullah Sahin and Dr. Yahya Birt. I know you're saying, you are a doctor. Yeah, so that's important to me. Just letting me in. Okay, I think we can just a couple more people. I'll admit people as we come in anyway. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome to our next session. Session right now on Zoom. It's Islamic Higher Education at a Crossroads. Retreating to epistemic economies of the sacred past, or reconnecting to the wisdoms, pedagogies of the living tradition in the modern world. Very privileged to have Dr. Abdullah Sahin from the University of Warwick, and it's hosted by our dear friend and teacher, Dr. Yahya Birt from the University of Leeds. Yahya is going to be taking over. He's going to be handling the program. So just to remind everyone, Dr. Yahya Birt is one of the leading British Muslim writers and academics in the West, who's currently doing the doctoral candidate at Leeds University. His academic research is focused on contemporary Islam in general and British Islam in particular. His writings and commentaries have been cited in a number of newspapers, including The Guardian, Economist, Intercept, Muslim News, and The Economist describes him as one of the most influential British Muslims. So without further ado, Yahya, I'm going to hand it over to yourself, and I will do all the technicality, inshallah. Thank you, Yahya.
Jazakallah. Thank you, Mizan, for that honorary doctorate. Very much appreciated. I take great pleasure in being able to host this chat for Islamic Circles, and a pleasure to connect digitally with my old friend, mentor and colleague, Dr. Abdullah Sahin. We were together at Markfield Institute for several years, and it's been a great pleasure for me, Abdullah, to see your work carry on to get the platform it needed at Warwick to expand and to thrive and to grow. And personally, I'm very much looking forward to myself catching up with how your work has progressed in the last 4 to 5 years at Warwick. So Doctor, for those of you who don't know him, Dr. Abdullah Sahin is Reader in Islamic Education at the University of Warwick, which specializes, as you know, in educational sciences. And Dr. Abdullah is strategically well placed at Warwick to lead an international revival in Islamic educational sciences. And so, Dr. Abdullah, for those of you, I'm sure that many people tuning in already will know your work, but for the benefits of those who maybe are coming across your work for the first time, would you mind just introducing in a few minutes a little bit about yourself and about what is Islamic pedagogy in the modern world?
Jazakallah, Yahya. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope all are well and safe. Thank you, Yahya, for this wonderful introduction, and Brother Mizan for facilitating what I think is probably the first post-mobility university experience. People, without feeling the need to move around, they're actually in the same virtual environment. So yet again, Mizan is pioneering, mashallah. I'm very pleased that we have this opportunity to reflect on, I suppose, new developments on Islamic higher learning in the modern world. And as a way of introduction, Yahya is right. There are maybe colleagues who have had a chance to read my monograph, which actually Yahya kindly edited it. So he's my Sheikh at-Tahrir, as those of you know Arabic. So I was very fortunate with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawfiq whole thing sort of gelled together in Markfield, where I completed my military service, by the way. That was meant to be a joke. Briefly, my story and Islamic pedagogy and Islamic education goes like this. I mean, I come from Turkey, a Muslim majority context, and then I found my way to UK, a Muslim minority context. I was originally trained in Islamic theology and textual studies, and my passion was for really Islamic legal hermeneutics for quite a time. But Birmingham experience, where I was supposed to be doing a doctorate, has changed everything, coming to know Muslims from subcontinent and the way in which Islam was communicated within this new context really was interesting to me. So I made a big leap of faith to social sciences, and I suppose during the last 2 decades, I would say I was involved with this major question, which can be really phrased like, what does it mean to be educated Islamically in the 21st century world? So the question is, what does it mean to be educated Islamically in this 21st century world where things are quite different? So that question really could be examined theoretically, historically. You could ask what is education in Islam, how Muslims imagine in the past education, or you can actually look at the experiences of people who are part of that process of learning and teaching of Islam. So as a way of grappling with this question, what does it mean to be educated Islamically in today's world? I first looked at experience of young British Muslim youth in the context of Birmingham initially. And that really enabled what I call an empirical insight. So usually in the Islamic world, we have this theoretical obsession that we always engage with issues theoretically. So the empirical context was interesting to understand how education is understood by Muslim community organizations, Muslim educationalists, and the learners, whose world was quite different. So that has made me to construct an empirical framework to assess the perception of education in Islam among young Muslims, the challenges they face, but most crucially, how that type of education shapes the Islamic identity, faith formation of the learners. And this is where we've developed a model, a psychosocial model to assess the impact, which is, those who have read my book, they would immediately know, is a fourfold typology, looking at how learning and teaching nurtures either a kind of a foreclosed mindset or an exploratory mindset. And essentially, you can actually measure this via various data collection and assessment techniques that are putting together into a semi-structured interview. And that is a bit of an assessment of attitudes, religious identity. But when we have unfolded that empirical research, the results were really interesting because they were indicating that education at home, in the madrasa, mosque, in fact, even in the Darul Uloom, those of who are not familiar with this vocabulary, these are the key pedagogic vocabulary of British Islam, I would say, from subcontinent. They were all indicating the formation of a very foreclosed mindset. And then the question was, really, education in Islam can only produce foreclosed mindsets. If theologically this was the only option, I suppose we have to just go along with it, just put up with the way in which Islamic values were communicated in creating this highly rigid, defensive, conservative, foreclosing mindset. But then when I began to examine education in Islam, things became very complicated and interesting. So the Quran and the Hadith and what the Islamic traditions say. After all, Muslims created a civilization. There must have been an educational perception that was quite reflective, transformative. And this is where I come up with crazy concepts. Some of my students tell me these are very crazy concepts. Like, in Islam, can we talk about critical faithfulness? Can we imagine application of an educational pedagogic hermeneutics to the text, to the Islamic tradition, to understand, to discern Islamic values. Because as you know, in Islamic classical sciences, law is crucial. So the mode of engagement with the scripture has always been, unfortunately, legalistic in a way. It has obviously advantages and disadvantages, but educationally, it appears to be producing rather very rigid mindsets. So, and I was very unfortunate to actually develop what I call a kind of a critical, reflective, transformative take on Islamic education and put into practice where Yahya mentioned in an Islamic institution, because the idea is you could have these very interesting ideas to actually transform education to become a catalyst for foreclosed mind or for transformative mindsets or exploratory. But you have to really see how your audiences, Muslim learners, are reacting to this. So the market field experience, around 10 years I spent with parallel graduates. Part of that experience was reflected in my book, the monograph as well, the reactions. So obviously it was put into an academic framework as a master's course. And then these faith leaders of different denominations, I suppose, they all came to this course, and the impact after the courses were quite positive, that education in Islam could actually become transformative and exploratory, and young faith leaders could actually use this as a diagnostic tool to examine their own faith formation and whether they're actually acting like foreclosed faith leaders or exploratory faith leaders. So in other words, it gave a new language to these young faith leaders to actually be reflective in terms of engaging with classical Islamic theological heritage. So I thought that was, in a sense, a really kind of a safer way of doing things, because there are some initiatives today where they say the only way is to make it more secularized, to teach a language of science, simply to make this foreclosed mindset reverse. But I think it's the other way around. Education in Islam has already inbuilt transformative qualities. If time permits, we'll give examples. Actually, the point is, it looks like contemporary Islamic higher learning has become far away from this transformative reflective heritage that is embedded in perception of education in Islamic core sources. So that was, if you like it, pre-Warwick. And I was always advocating that we need to really mainstream Islamic education within the higher academy, basically. So in other words, it is no good if we simply keep within the Islamic community context. So I had the confidence that actually humanities, education sciences, social sciences could offer a new interdisciplinary opportunity to put actually this reflective, exploratory take on what education is in Islam in a kind of a much more exciting academic context. And Warwick provided that within this humanities and social science department. I was very lucky that the experiment was...
Abdullah, before you go on to Warwick, just a minute, really, nothing more than that. But in your monograph, you also did empirical research in Kuwait, where you basically, in a Muslim majority context, where essentially you found the same issue, that the state educational system in Islamic studies was also producing a majority of foreclosed identities amongst Muslim youth in Kuwait. So in other words, the minority versus the majority context was frankly quite irrelevant, and whether it was being organized by communities as in a minority context, or whether it was being organized at a state level in a majority context, really what mattered was the pedagogic techniques and the way in which the curriculum was delivered, rather than minority versus majority context. So I just wanted to throw that in as well, that the scope of your work has an international relevance. In other words, it's not just about minorities in Europe or Muslim minorities elsewhere in the world, but it's also has insights for Muslim majority countries too.
Absolutely. Very good intervention, Yahya. Brilliant. You are right. I did actually put empirical sort of framework to be able to give us evidence whether these typical issues of four closed minds are actually exclusive to being a minority. But then, after 3 years of experiments in a very sort of modernized, highly wealthy part of majority of Islamic Muslim majority context in Kuwait, we found exactly almost similar type of findings, albeit the four closed shades were quite different, obviously. But they were all indicating the way in which Islamic literacy conveyed, the way in which Islamic leadership was formed, was based on rather rigid techniques, as you rightly called pedagogic techniques of learning and teaching, that were really not nurturing a kind of exploratory mindset. So in other words, education both in Islamic minority and majority context seems to be not really being a transformative catalyst. Hence, the leadership seems to be sort of reproduced in the same type of foreclosed mentality. Hence, the way in which Islam is being put into practice, or the way in which Islam is guiding us, has become almost entrenched in this foreclosed mindset. Now, there are complex reasons. I'm not just saying it's simply a matter of learning.
No, I understand, but keeping an eye on the clock, because it's let's move on now to Warwick, and
That's
maybe
right.
people can follow up points in questions. So how has the nature of your work changed since you moved to Warwick in the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I suppose fundamentally, the kind of work I was doing at an Islamic higher education institution was similar, but what is really exciting, as I said, is the university opportunity of being able to engage and interact with other disciplines, which was lacking in an Islamic institute, where it was heavily focused on only one type of science, theology or Islamic studies. So what Warwick gave was opening up to the humanities and social sciences, which has always been part of my broader intervention as to how we address this entrenched, foreclosed educational culture in our communities, internationally and nationally. So the students who come to my courses, where I teach now, I direct Warwick's postgraduate program in Islamic education, where we have an MA, we have one of the very first UK's bridging courses, we call PGA, a short course, where we actually, in a sense, take seriously what Muslim young people spend in a Darul Uloom setting, in a traditional Islamic seminary. Instead of alienating, we actually acknowledge that education, and then they are able to actually access to a kind of mainstream education. So we have a short postgraduate award course where mostly Darul Uloom graduates come along, and then there's an MA program, and then we have a research program. So all of this obviously cannot be done unless you have a research culture, where you have interdisciplinary opportunities of interacting with colleagues and other sciences. And that, for me, has been really lacking. And that was, in a sense, that Warwick, this is our fourth year, finished our fourth year now, has enabled that kind of interdisciplinarity, really. So I can say that Islamic education now is becoming, to my knowledge, it's the only model, so far as I can see, in fact, even in majority Islamic context universities, it is the kind of an interdisciplinary field of critical scholarly study, empirical research, and professional practice. I think that has, in a sense, established itself now. As we attract quality, talented young people to the field, they all realize the significance of really focusing on how do we actually address this set of questions around education in Islam. So Warwick has given that kind of platform, I would say, and a new, essentially, opportunity of impact, which I wasn't getting before. Because let's be clear, Islamic higher learning institutions in the world actually are generally aligned with certain Islamic networks and movements. And you have got that kind of unfortunate association in a sense that it breaks people's interest. Whereas university is much more mainstreaming, and therefore advocating people to actually become experts and talk about educational issues based on evidence, rather than simply lecture and assume that the wisdom that they carry is all relevant to what we're experiencing.
But isn't that not in your own practical experience, and the many conversations we've had about this over the years, Abdullah, isn't that far from given? Because although you make an institutional move into a mainstream university, what we see now in the West, at least, is the importation of Islamic argumentation or positions within the academy, and playing out within the academy. And surely, on top of what you're saying, is that more than an institutional move into the mainstream, surely what you also need is an approach that's inclusive enough to allow people to benefit from what you're offering, from whatever background they come from. So you're not trying to change people's theological commitments, but what you're trying to do is to give them new tools to make education transformative, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's very true. It's an inclusive platform, but like any kind of education, if obviously it is not transformative in a sense, it doesn't really doing its job. Yeah. I suppose what we are offering is a transformative take on Islamic education. But you are right, it is not a faith-based activity. So we obviously respect that, you know, university secular context requires competence to detach what you are doing, hence be inclusive. Indeed, my courses attract lots of non-Muslims too. And that is really beautiful, because we have now a chance, if you consider, you are right, within the whole debates about colonial, post-colonial, decolonial attempts, arguments around how we study, I suppose, Islam. What really I offer is a much more maybe exciting opportunity. By the way, I kind of frame my area, not Islamic studies, if you notice, but Islamic education. This is a little bit different, and Islamic studies obviously has its own legacy. But what I'm offering is really, I feel Islamic studies is too much a narrow frame by Muslims, and in fact the secular academy. But Islamic education, I think, is much more inclusive, where you have space for scholarly study of Islam, but also what education does to communities, peoples. And that is really an educational, higher level conversation, which I think such a framing enables this kind of involvement. We have a popular summer school every year at Warwick, where we get around 30 people, and half of all this audience are actually non-Muslim, those who happen to be either teaching Islam or studying Islam. And they found a kind of interesting take, the way we look at the issues. So in other words, yes, we are kind of crossing boundaries of the conventional academia in a sense. So what we have done in Warwick is, in a sense, I would say, humbly, maybe it is an experiment that goes beyond what has been experienced in the large of the Western academy in some Islamic studies. So the way we frame Islamic education gives a bit of flexibility to even examine the pedagogic discourses that are forming study of Islam in a secular context. So the programs I run are not simply examining Islam taught in the Islamic institutional context, but also the way Islam is being taught, studied, explored, and researched within the academia. Because ultimately, aside from specialisms, you could be a historian or you could be a sociologist, but you are involved in the study and the teaching and learning of Islam. There's a pedagogic dimension that's always been left out in the discussions on how we can actually study best Islam without reducing it to the Western categories or turning into a confessional Islamic theological exercise. So I suppose these are really concerns for Islamic education, I would say, and we are trying to work out this frame. But can I just come back now, if you allow me, I think time is pressing now, to come to our promised title that the Islamic Higher Learning institutions currently, what I think are either retreating into this comfort zone of replicating, trying to replicate some past epistemic frameworks or institutions, rather than actually engaging with the challenge of bringing the wisdom traditions of education in Islam to guide us today. Shall we just say a little bit?
Yes, yeah, by all means, yeah.
So, I mean, recently I became quite interested in, as I said, as part of this, how do we locate the study of Islam, and how do we actually enable education to become transformative, not only within the Islamic community, but also with the wider academia. Was really my interest in the Islamic higher education institutions. And those who have probably spread around and are part of these institutions globally now, minority majority context, they would know that the entire current debates go back to probably a key historic event in 1977, where we had the first Islamic education conference took place in Mecca. Afterwards was repeated, this annual international Islamic education conferences. And 1977 was a watershed because they were trying to really put together a framework to, I suppose, revive what was thought to be a lost golden Islamic higher education past. And of course, then with a lot of petrol dollars, I would say, a kind of a vision was constructed to revive the fortune of Islamic higher education institutions and save them from westernization, secularization, and developing an Islamic alternative. I think that is a crucial watershed event that probably people are aware. And if not aware, there's a short book by Ashraf and late scholar Ashraf and Bilgrami called The Concept of an Islamic University. It's only 70 pages. I recommend people to read, but you can see that it was a great opportunity of rethinking what education is in Islam. But unfortunately, that exercise turned into a huge reaction to that which was assumed to be perceived to be an invading, colonial, secular, materialistic education of the West to the Islamic world. So those who follow the story, they would know that that project ended up promoting what I really recognize today as a kind of a moralizing concept, unfortunately, called adab, which has been the key theoretical, I suppose, philosophical idea for quite a long time. And it has led into infamous now Islamization of knowledge. I don't want to go into the details of this, but we have to learn from really the past experiences. And I think out of that exercise, what was probably to me missing was this lack of looking at education in Islam and it is diverse educational traditions and wisdom traditions. So there was this heavily reactionary sort of reading of education with the word adab and ta'dib. Obviously, I understand there will be different views on this, but at least if you look at the publications, that has led into the creation of international Islamic universities. I suppose what one really wanted to see was people kind of respecting that education is also a social scientific discipline. It has humanities, it has philosophy. What we didn't produce over the last 3 decades is really, I would say, educational philosophers. So today we don't have much, I would say, out of that exercise, new innovative educational ideas or creativity in educational thinking. Therefore, I believe that the space of education has become too much heavily framed by the practitioners with only a kind of a survival mode of passing some knowledge, Islamic literacy to their young generations. So in other words, one of my criticism is the fact that this decades long, 3-4 decades, until probably 9/11, we didn't have much output in terms of quality models of educational thinking. As a result, the institutions that they actually were put up, were invested in, it looks like with today's standards, their impact has been very minimal, unfortunately, in terms of productivity, generating new knowledge. It looks like we don't really have a case to make that even that kind of chance was lost. There are always exceptions, but we have to bear in mind, my own experience has been mostly recently with Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. And I know that each country has its own well-established Islamic movements, and they have been experimenting with different Islamic higher education models that actually created a new language to offer, I suppose, a different reflective Islam in the modern world. So Indonesia is a good example, and anybody's familiar with. We have obviously the largest Muslim majority country. We have, 30, 40 Islamic universities, actually. I was so shocked to discover. But obviously, even all of these experiments were really happening within the indigenous, sort of highly politically charged Islamic movement environment. And Indonesia would be Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. But nevertheless, they have really made a big progress in what was in 1977 promised, that was an integrated Islamic educational curriculum that actually was in the documents in the Mecca conference. But this idea of how do we integrate contemporary knowledge with Islamic knowledge was never brought into actually a fruition, really. But Indonesia seems to be a little bit different because they have experimented with this indigenization and also with secular modernity, and kind of created a dialectic between the Western Islamic traditions and also local wisdom traditions. So that there are always exceptions. When I say we don't have much Islamic educational new ideas, but nevertheless, not enough to be able to transform Muslim societies to face with contemporary challenges, which I see as the key task of higher education, is to be able to build confidence, to be able to obviously enable to understand the heritage reflectively, openly, but also to be able to create opportunities of Islamically guiding the Muslim societies within these complex, challenging times. So we do need this kind of double-edged informing, but as well as at the same time transforming mode. And I would say,
Abdullah, we've reached a half-hour mark, so I was wondering if we could cut it here and move on to questions. Would that be okay?
Just my final sentence would be in other words, obviously it's good to reveal a lot of weaknesses in what we have, but it's difficult to put an alternative. But I didn't have time now. I have worked very hard to actually put forward an alternative through my work as well, which those who have read my monograph would know is actually an educational model based on tarbiyah concept. And it is obviously subsequent implications at different levels, Islamic faith-based context, as well as Islamic, in the study of Islam in the higher education level. So in other words, we do have lots of stories of telling us what things are missing. Often we don't have alternatives, but I do believe that at Warwick, we have actually produced a little bit of a model as to how to make an intervention to actually create a blueprint for a maybe much more transformative Islamic higher learning framework with ideas and practices. But that is, hopefully will come through the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody should forgive each other, because an hour is far too little amount of time either for Dr. Sahin to explain, if you like, his critique of previous modern attempts at integration, and also his own theological and practitioner solutions, which are actually hard to, if you like, in my experience, hard to pigeonhole either as modern or traditionalist. Okay, they sit across these sorts of reductive categories, which have bedeviled this conversation about reviving education. You know, so there's been a lot of polemical exchange over the years. So I think a lot of the questions that we've received so far have been responding, I think, been wanting Dr. Abdullah to comment further on previous attempts at integration in the last 40 years. But I think if I can get the forgiveness of the people who've asked those questions, it might be better if we direct more towards the questions that are looking at solutions. Okay, because seeing as we only really have about less than half an hour now, I think we should focus on that. So let me go first of all with the chair's prerogative to pick my first question from Mushtaq Ahmed, who asked, is it even possible to have an Islamic university as a concept, as a real, you know, what would it actually look like, an Islamic university?
Very good question. Yes, indeed. That title of a book that I've recited is a good way to start for brother who asked the question.
Yeah,
so
Mushtaq,
Brother Mushtaq could look at Bilgrami's book, but in 1977 they thought they had an answer for that, and that answer was, we just Islamize the Western academia in its all complex sciences. That was obviously proved to be quite a futile task. But the real question is, if we could describe qualified education Islamically, I do believe, yes, we have a case to make that we could actually have an Islamic university. But it won't be quite a model imagined by our great forefathers in 1977. So the key question is to reflect on, can education be described Islamically? This is a hermeneutic question, by the way. And I do believe, yes, it is possible. So you could have an Islamic education ethos academia, where you have freedom of research, freedom of thought, where you have all kinds of interdisciplinary sciences, where you don't have hangover of the post-colonial, sadly. Yes, it is possible that you could create a transformative university environment where the ethos of learning and teaching could be Islamically framed. I think this is possible. And it is not always answer is it will end up with literalism, dogmatism, and foreclosed mindsets. So we don't have time to go back to that. It all depends on really what we define education to be and how do we define it Islamically. The problem is the answers so far are very foreclosed, and there is a danger, of course. Yeah. But I think there is an exploratory, reflective definition of education. And I'll give you a basic, simple example. Classical Islamic scholars, when they defined what education is, they simply said, tarbiyah, my favorite concept, إنشاء الشيء حالا فحالا إلى حد التمام, to facilitate growth of something to its completion, fulfillment through stages. They didn't say التربية الإسلامية. I think this is something brilliant. Our ancients, they've actually configured that education is actually more than a label. We have to reclaim that dynamic, inclusive take on, I would say, the concept of tarbiyah.
Okay, as a follow-up question to the first question, Mushtaq, there's a question from Rashid Dar, and he's asking basically that if we were to kind of reinvent the wheel, if we were going to make a new statement 45 years on from the 1977 conference, we were to have another global plenary, okay, what would be the kind of starting point? Let's say we had that post-colonial optimism, we could get everybody in the room together. What would be the theme of the conference? What would be the grand theme of the conference? What would be the starting point now?
Yeah, well, I would say what we have to open up our perception of what education is to a scrutiny. Because I think we all have vested, loaded concepts. But I think the other thing would be, why is it that education and knowledge in Muslim societies is really not transformative? How could we assess this? I think we need to have an empirical sort of an eagle eye insistence to look at evidence, and then to look at why is it that education is simply not transformative. It is to do with nature of Islam, our societies. It is to do with all kinds of cultural issues maybe. But essentially, I would say we need to have a genuine examination of issues openly, and that begins our perception of what education is.
Okay. I think that I'd like to move on to a question from Muhammad Omar, where he asks, if we understand Islamic education as a strict critical -- reflective -- transformative tarbiyah, as you put it, pedagogy or pedagogical consideration, how then do we amalgamate the other notable dimensions of Islamic educational philosophy, such as ta'aleem and ta'adib? Wouldn't you be more sympathetic towards an emancipatory educational program embedded in an Islamic worldview?
Sure. Therefore, we have to examine tarbiyah. The concept of tarbiyah to me is an inclusive concept where there is criticality, reflectivity, but there is plenty of scope for devotional spiritual awareness. We didn't have time to examine this. I do believe that in Islamic vocabulary of pedagogy we've inherited in the Quran and the prophetic tradition, I would say tarbiyah is most inclusive of both the critical, reflective, what you need in academia, but also devotional spiritual awareness, where you need values. But we have not time to examine this. Clearly, ta'aleem is instruction and teaching. Surely you've got to have teaching, literacy, but all education, if it's reduced to only teaching, there is no growth into humanity, is there? So tarbiyah enables instruction, teacher, learner, but ultimately it's a learner-led process. So if you remember those who know Arabic, rububiyyah is a good concept. God depicts himself as an educator. Hence, education is for humanity. God facilitates growth into humanity. So I would say that in the tarbiyah model, the chances are spiritual moral is not reduced to moralizing and disciplining that the adab, unfortunately, might lead to.
Yeah, well, I'm also worried. But the questions are branching off in all sorts of different directions, understandably. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to chair and do justice to all of them. But let me try and pick up one of the threads here. So this is again from Asad Zaman. So he's asking, I think it's following up from the point you just made, that this tension when we're rethinking Islamic education between form, what form will it take, and its substance. And I assume by that he means the substantive end goals that it would have. I think you've sort of answered that question in terms of tarbiyah. Okay, yeah. But he gives an interesting example here, which cuts across your field of Islamic education. So he's saying here, he works in Islamic economics, and he finds that in between the form, there's actually enormous amount of valuable substance in Islamic economics. But I don't know whether he was going on to say whether or not that's been properly articulated or not. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah. Well, I would say the danger is with all the work that, when you qualify something Islamic or Islamically, the danger is always to end up with simplistic essentialism. We want to avoid that. But obviously, we don't want to throw the baby with the wash water. So if we are going to make a claim to define education within Islamic value framework, there got to be obviously a space to be creative. You can't simply end up saying Islamic education, hence basically memorize certain texts and have a kind of an indoctrination process. But tarbiyah doesn't allow this. Yes, and we don't need to end up with nominalism either. Anything could be Islamic, anything goes stuff. But people say around, the famous argument made by, I'm not very fond of what this great anthropologist, Talal Asad, nominalism. So in other words, the idea of discursive, that means the way in which we imagine what Islamic education is. It's a discursive framing, ultimately. The way in which, we employ, of course, certain qualifications, but we have to be aware when you say substance, often ends up with certain essentialized historical formulations of Islam. And that is a danger. I see this in the, for example, Muslim minority context of UK, where you have diverse forms of Islamic higher education institutions, each claims to be representing the authentic Islamic educational heritage. Is it the Khangah, Zawiyah of the Sufi take, or is it the sober sort of critically engaging textual scholar of subcontinent traditions, the reformist traditions? So in other words, how do we reconstruct Islamic higher learning if we don't want to give up on Islam, which I insist we shouldn't give up on Islam? It must have some flexibility inbuilt, where we do convey substance, the knowledge, but we also understand the inevitable hermeneutic, interpretative process that shapes that and puts limitations. So I think the balance could be maintained. And I do believe that the word tarbiyah actually beautifully frames, because you have to build on nurture and guide and lead. All of these meanings are embedded. Hence, you are not simply emulating a Western model, or you are ending up with trying to restructure or reconstitute some old historical imagined ideal Islamic learning environment. So dialectic, or kind of a process, it needs to be balanced. In other words, avoid essentialism, avoid nominalism. And tarbiyah does this.
Thank you. I think I'm going to, with apologies to Asad and others who are pursuing these more philosophical dimensions of your project, I want to move back to another thread of questions that have been coming through, which are a little bit more pragmatic and institutional in nature, because I know that is also a big part of your work as an educator. You're interested in practical solutions too. So I've got I've got two questions here from Hasib Manor from London, and he asked two questions. The first is, what kind of solutions do you think secular higher educational institutions are providing in light of the divide there is between Western academia and traditional seminaries. Okay, I know that's very relevant to your work. Okay, and he comments, it seems there's a divide in terms of objectives in the light of what practical goals are envisaged by practitioners versus quote unquote hybrid graduates of both systems. Okay, and so he goes on to ask, what are your thoughts on the application of higher education in the West versus the East in the epistemic understanding of Islam? So what's the end goal? What's your end goal? You know, in other words, what are you aiming? What would you like to see at the end of your sort of journey of transformative Islamic pedagogy?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question. Jazakallah khair, brother. It's a practical issue because it affects all of us. We have, I don't know, 100 odd Darul Ulooms in the UK. There are graduates, but the fact is they are not part of the wider further education or Western higher education. Now, practically, this creates a problem because the graduates, when they come up out of these institutions, no matter how good they are, no matter how wonderful theologically they are equipped, their degrees are not recognized. They don't have job opportunities. They don't have access to market or, in fact, furthering higher education dreams that they have. So we have practical issues facing Islamic higher education. And we have obviously hybrid models of Islamic higher education in the UK, where, again, we don't have really an answer. Now, I myself in favor of having Islamic version of higher education institutions. I think diversity is always very good. But the fact is, sociologically speaking, currently our Islamic higher education institutions, including the hybrid ones, a couple of them, they're really educationally, in terms of infrastructure, they're not really there yet in terms of responding to what is needed. I would say currently what we need is pragmatic collaboration with universities or the seminaries, where we do keep the ethos differences, but it doesn't really harm if you are able to deliver a set of competences, skills that will make learning and teaching more interactive and productive. So in other words, I would say the crossing point is pedagogic imagination, because pedagogy is all to do with how do we make learning and teaching more effective. So I can see, although we have goal differences, but we all have interest in empowering young people to learn, to become inquisitive, to find jobs, to develop competencies. So I believe that the dialogue is essential between Islamic and so-called secular higher education institutions. In fact, it is required as a civic duty of secular universities. So therefore, I mean, at Warwick, for example, we have experimented, as I just mentioned, as a way of creating a dialogue with Islamic seminaries and with the secular university through this PGA course. And I think it has been a really rewarding experience because people realized from admissions to looking at different types of modules to realize there are different pedagogic practices, but they're not really too far away from each other. You can actually make sense. What is not acceptable is having a totally isolated world where there is no interaction. And ultimately, the graduates end up obviously operating in a society where we all interact with one another. This is a really good area of, I would say, research, and where we have to think of this integrative models of Islamic higher education, where we actually interact. The point is, this seminary is a theological seminary, or it's more than this. You know, what is a madrasa? You know, famously people ask question. Historically, it has never always simply been legal college or a theological college or a simple spiritual place. Madrasa became a jamia, an inclusive really place, where you have all kinds of sciences, in fact, interacted. A curriculum was integrated from the naqliyat to aqliyat to the humanities stuff. So in other words, I say we need pedagogic interaction pragmatically as soon as possible to recognize the kind of education takes place in the community. But also we need to really gear up our language in terms of Islamic higher education, the way we frame it. We can't simply continue as we are trying to do is totally isolate ourselves from the wider language. That doesn't mean we have to sign up to neoliberal university idea, but the fact is, you know, we're in the kind of the same wider framework where there are expectations from the graduates, they have life to lead, they need to have skills. So the pedagogic exchange, I would say, and dialogue is crucial.
I think that you've inadvertently answered Aisha Sayed's question, which was about the need to remove dichotomy between the Islamic and the non-Islamic. What you're saying is that
Yeah.
this is a colonial or post-colonial hangover, but in the past, madrasas were not, quote unquote, Islamic in the way that we see them today. If I'd like to follow on with a question from Dr. Haroon Siddart from the University of Cardiff. He asked an interesting question. He says, isn't the real challenge for the diaspora that education was everywhere and reinforced in all sectors of society? So practically, do we need to think more in terms of Berger's idea of plausibility structures? In other words, are we putting too much emphasis on religious leadership and religious institutions, if you like, for what we mean by education or tarbiyah?
Well, that's, I mean, Dr. Haroon, assalamu alaikum. Good question, as usual, of course, from a very reflective researcher and a faith leader. So have I lost you?
No, I don't know what's happened. Something's happened with the system, but
never mind. Yeah, I think yes, I understand, of course, the poor Muslim faith leader who are being dragged into the role of an imam, a pastoral caregiver, a social worker, an educator. Yes, I think there are a lot of probably unrealistic expectations of faith leader in our communities. That's very true. But also, we have to have the question, the degree to which our institutions are able to actually equip this kind of faith leaders. In other words, if the current Darul Ulooms, 80% of the graduates, particularly females, I work a lot with sisters, by the way, have woke up to the reality, empirical reality of actually there are more female graduates than male from our Darul Ulooms. Looking at my courses, basically, they all end up in a teaching and learning role. So what is wrong if our seminary is to have some sort of pedagogic upskilling course or two available, because they end up practically teaching. The fact is, we have a huge Islamic schooling sector, for example. I don't know whether sister from Austria, she's with us. We don't have in Western Europe an Islamic teacher education college. Hence, we have schools waiting for Muslim educators to be teaching Islam. So in other words, I think there's an unfairness of expecting too much from these graduates, but there are also wider questions to be asked. Why is it that these institutions that we have currently are not willing to essentially consider offering diversity of what a faith leader would need in 21st century British context? So in other words, why this immutability, why this petrification of what we do? But nevertheless, he is right. I think we should be realistic. The way in which imam or faith leader is imagined, is he imagined to be a parish minister, or is it going to be, what kind of a model we have in mind for an imam to function? And that's a good question. I think there is a lot of unrealistic expectations. But nevertheless, the leadership formation education needs, in my view, rethinking and possibly connecting these institutions with universities. Not necessarily always with theological departments, by the way, with all due respect. I think what they need is much more social science and education, which is lacking, because they end up in practical jobs that they need this kind of pedagogic education of skilling. So in other words, we do need really, essentially, a kind of a guarded opening up of these institutions. And I believe that they may well lead into the formation of maybe the first European Islamic teacher education institutions. Why don't we have one Darul Uloom specialized in education, training of teachers, for example? Why don't we have another one specializing in social work, X, Y, Z? The question is really to be a little bit be thinking outside the box educationally, and that has been missing for 2-3 decades. That really is no longer maintaining. In other words, with all due respect to Islamic studies academic framework, there are really plenty around. But I would say that the Islamic seminaries, being theological places, they really, in a sense, need to maybe consider alternatives a little bit, because what they do is not pure Islamic studies, in my view. It's a theological exercise. It's a different, really, area. Again, the challenge I put is those people who are running these institutions need to really consider whether they need a new educational pedagogic language, in addition to their roles as the leaders running these institutions.
Just to wrap up, because I think this has to be a final question. a kind of recurring thread that we haven't picked up on so far is coming from our various listeners who are coming in from Muslim majority countries. And the kind of line of the question is, in other words, is there good practice in Muslim majority societies that we can still learn from? Is it totally a dark picture? Or you already mentioned in Indonesia, is there somewhere else you could mention? And also people are also saying that in previous modern attempts to conceptualize an integrated Islamic education, is there still nothing that we could pick up of use? So I think that there's a concern that maybe you're being overly critical, and is there not room for things to build on? I think that's how I would summarize these kind of other questions that are coming through.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Indeed, of course, if you adopt an educational worldview, education is all about being humble to learn. There is no doubt that we can learn from examples in majority Muslim countries, definitely. The kind of adventure began since 1977. I don't want to bracket out the energy, the passion, the sincerity that went into all these projects are really wonderful. And I really believe that there is plenty to could help us. And you know, I mentioned particularly the late great Palestinian American scholar Farouki, for example. You know, there's no time to go into all the details, but clearly, you know, this is our heritage, it's our legacy. You know, if we are being reflective critically, doesn't mean we don't want to benefit from it. We definitely do. But we also need to have a bit of confidence and courage to say, is there space to be a little bit critical, in a sense that to find out whether what they put forward what were their strengths and weaknesses that we can build on. And I think if you adopt this mode, the chances are we might really achieve a better balanced view. And my view is that there has been too much investment in the last 40 years or so in certain ideas. I think time has arrived, in my view, to enable to allow a little bit open, free sort of models to come across. I say this with all due respect to people, of course, running universities. There are lots of experimentation going on. But ultimately, when we examine them, I don't see kind of a reflective Islamic educational philosophy is guiding most of these practices. And there are reasons for this. And my invitation is, of course, to people to share the best practice. But nevertheless, this education in Islam, as far as I can see, is an egalitarian exercise. It cannot be simply reduced into, you know, group A, group A's sort of epistemic, what I called retreat. We got to open up. And I think that requires a bit of educational hermeneutics, a bit of patience to be able to think educationally. And my view is most of the people who are involved in education sector, with all due respect, with sincerity, they don't really give sort of time and space to say, am I qualified? Do I need to maybe check whether I really have an understanding of education? So in other words, education simply is taken for granted by many, but in the 21st century, education is really a specialism, and Islam and its educational vision is transformative, but if you're unable to discern it, if you don't have a method, a hermeneutic, you will never catch. In other words, we also need a lot of exercise on really being able to read our heritage pedagogically and educationally. This cannot be done with some sort of recent flavor of the month stuff, you know, postmodern readings of Islam and Islamic heritage, or introducing science and we will reverse the process. I think it's much more complex than that. And that's that. Having said that, we do need to understand Islamic world produced local wisdom traditions, which is what I call. And I do believe that, you know, there is plenty of such wisdom around that surely we can benefit, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahin. Before we wrap up, I wondered if you just wanted to pay tribute to the late Morris Irfan Coles, the educationist, who I don't know if you're aware, but he passed away from the
I didn't know that.
The COVID-19 infection just a few days ago. So I wondered if we should say a Fatiha for him and
absolutely
say a few words in tribute to his work before we wrap up.
Thank you. I came across to him, I think, 2 or 3 times. Really great brother who was genuinely into this wisdom, tradition, and education in Islam. He was very fond, and it's really a great loss to the education community, I would say. May Allah bless his soul, inshallah.
Ameen.
وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you very much
Jazakallah khair.
of you across the world for our first post-mobility university experience. And thank you, Mizan and Yahya, for facilitating this.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. May Allah accept our works, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Yahya, and thank you, everyone. Just a fine reminder: if you want to get the recording, if you haven't registered, please leave us your email address here. Once again, thank you so much to Dr. Sahin. Please get his books; very important. The link is going to be on the chat. If not, I will send you the emails as well. And once again, thank you so much for Yahya for bringing it.
Thank you very much, Mizan.
Thank you. No problems. Inshallah, we hope to do maybe later on after Ramadan a one day on this subject, a very intensive, going through some of the findings you have in the last 5 years, post Markfield, post Warwick as well, raise the and give us some feedback, because there's a lot of good questions about the models of education and Islamic, especially on IIIT's Islamization project, and then Sayyid Naqib Al-Attasi's project. We didn't get a chance to do some of them, some of the stuff you're doing as well, and
yeah. And please also check our University of Warwick website. I'll pass on to Brother Mizan to share with the group our programs, our summer school, our MA, PGA, and the doctorate program. More than happy if people want to just look at and get more information.
Yeah, and this is a working model in progress. This is the
absolutely,
key.
yes.
This is a working model in progress. It's not just theoretical. You've actually been doing some practical stuff with their own graduates, Islamic schools, teachers and stuff like that. This is the key thing. It's not something pie in the sky. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Great focus, inshallah. Hope to see you in the next session.
Happy Ramadan, inshallah. Keep safe and keep well, all of you.
Take care.
Salam.